Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of the Call-in Subcommittee of the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board. As the first item on the agenda is election of chair, can I ask for a nomination, please? Can I have a nomination for chair, please? Okay, thank you. Is that seconded? Thank you. Any other nominations? Okay, over to you, Councillor.
Can I nominate Jeff, please?
Okay, is that seconded?
I'll second that.
Okay, so then we put it to the vote, please. So all those for the first nomination, which is Councillor Don Alexander. Okay, then that's carried. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. For those who've not been here before, just to let you know that we have toilets outside, gentlemen to the left and down the stairs, ladies to the right and down the stairs. And if there is a fire alarm, then we are not expecting a fire alarm test today, so assume that it's genuine. And please exit from the main door through which you've probably come. Go to your right and down and assemble where the UE graduates are having their graduation in front of the cathedral. Thank you. Can I ask for any declarations?
Just a point of order, Chair. Can I just put on record the fact that I have not been whipped, and can I ask other members to also confirm that that is the position for them?
Could you all confirm that you've not been whipped, please? Okay, that's confirmed. Any declarations of interest from any members? Okay, thank you.
Chair, before we start, may I just make an observation?
Yes.
Most people on either side of the chamber in this process have expressed concern that significant papers were only made available with very, very short notice. And as a result, most people here have had insufficient time to read some of those papers. I'll leave it at that, but I want to make that a formal objection. Thank you.
It's not unusual for you to make that point, Anthony. Would you like to answer? Yes.
I'm sorry, Chair, if you're setting the tone of the meeting in that way. That was a perfectly valid point in this situation. We have had a matter of half an hour to an hour to look at those papers. If you've already made up your mind and don't bother to read them, for some people, that's fine. But for those who want to do this job properly, independently and objectively, that is a fair point. And if you're going to respond in that way, I'm afraid it does set a very depressing tone for the rest of this meeting. So I hope you might reconsider.
We'll continue with the meeting. The purpose of the meeting, we do not have the power here to change the Mayor's decision. What is being called in are elements of the process through which the Mayor has come to his conclusions. And we are going to move to those who have called in this decision, and we're going to ask them to explain their reasons why they feel the Mayor has not, in Article 14, I believe, of the Constitution, observed proportionality, openness, transparency, and if we refer to, and if I in fact refer to the paper with a call-in decision on it, which is published with everyone. You can see it laid out in a table. The names of the callers in and the reasons why they feel Article 14 has not been properly observed in the making of this decision. So I will now hand over to... Oh, you would like to make... Would you like it now? I hand over to Nancy here. Thank you.
So, members, just to be clear that although the Cabinet report itself and the appendix was published and is an open document, you've also been given access to exempt legal advice. And so I need to make sure that you are aware that in giving your responses or asking your questions, you are very aware not to disclose any information that you've seen in that exempt legal advice. And we are aware that it's going to be very difficult to refer to the legal advice that was in the Cabinet report without possibly straying into the legal advice that you've written, that you've read, that is exempt. So I will be keeping a very close watching brief, and I will step in if needs be. And I've already discussed with you the implications of inadvertently disclosing legal advice, which is to waive our privilege to that advice from publication. So what we will do is we'll address all the issues that don't relate to legal advice first with your agreement, and then move into exempt session to discuss in more detail the exempt legal advice that you've had access to.
So when I no longer feel that we can have a meaningful discussion in open session, we will move into exempt session, and then we will come out of exempt session and return to open session in order that we can make our conclusions and our resultant decision in public scrutiny. I hope that's clear to everyone. So now I'm going to offer the chance to those who have called in this decision to make their point. If you could raise your hand, I will attempt to. Councillor Comley.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for making the time to hear this call-in today. As we've said, call-in is about the process. It's not about the substance of the decision. You might think that this is the deal of the century. You might think it's a terrible use of that publicly owned land. It doesn't matter. That's not what we're here to decide. We're here to look at the decision and at specific grounds on which that decision can be, the process can be challenged. And as we've already discussed, the call-in panel is not whipped or expected to vote on party lines, but to listen impartially to the evidence. And I'm sure we'll see that today. So we're calling in this decision on a number of grounds, but at the heart of them is the lack of any competitive process of procurement or market testing. Article 14, to which the Chair referred, of our Constitution, and also EU and ECHR law, all hold the principle that the action must be proportionate to the outcomes. This proposal disposes of council-owned land, which has already had millions of pounds spent on it, commits to spending unspecified millions more on further infrastructure and remediation works, spending £500,000 on design work, and to 40 years of underwriting rent if tenants cannot be found. So we need to ask, is this proportionate to the aim of getting a mixed-use development built on this site? Without a proper procurement process, or even any attempt to market test this proposal with other potential developers, we just don't know if this is the best deal, or a good deal, or an okay deal, or if the same objectives could have been achieved with much less cost and risk for the council. And Cabinet, I would say, did not know when they made this decision because that procurement process had not taken place. Another important principle is the clarity of the aims and the outcomes. This decision commits the council to a path to pursue an arrangement in which it has no control over the detail or form of the development. This was stated in the Cabinet papers. Given the stated aims of delivering affordable housing on this site, of getting a conference centre and hotel in the centre of the city, and delivering social value for Bristol, there is no clarity as how the outcomes of this action link to those aims. So I would argue that, again, we are not following the process laid out in Article 14. Finally, and I promise I'm not going to go into detail on this until we're in exempt session, it is clear that failing to follow a full competitive procurement process exposes the council to the risk of legal challenge, as we've seen in the case of Faraday versus West Berkshire Council. So I think when we do go into exempt session, we need to look in detail at what legal advice the council received, at who actually read it, and whether it was followed. And we need to ask whether the risk of legal challenge, with costs, compensation and penalty potentially awarded against the council, is proportionate to the aim of pushing through this development quickly.
Thank you, Chair. Following on from that, I'm going to focus more specifically on the issue of proportionality. The Council objective of seeking best value for what it does and maximum social value for what it does, in keeping with the Council's recently updated social value policies. In a proposal where there appears to be no legal obligation to deliver the things we want from the development on the island, no guaranteed outputs, it does seem likely that the greater value accrues to the developer, not to the council, not to the public, because the public aren't guaranteed any of those objectives that you've heard about, of affordable housing, of a conference centre, and so on. Had we any information at all on discussions with developers, on options being explored with developers, on proposals for a variety of mixed uses with developers? Had we any information at all on the types of valuations that have been sought for the types of benefits and outcomes we want, above the repayment of the public money that has already been sunk into what was Arena Island? Then we would know that we're getting a substantial, or indeed any, significant value in return. But at the moment we don't, because we don't know that we're going to get anything back. All we know is we've put millions of pounds of public money and have promised additional public money, somewhat open-ended amounts, into a proposal that we have no control over. So I would be looking immediately, and in my past life I helped write the best value guidance for the council, actually in the 90s, and it said we have to have options, we have to look at the benefits to us, we have to know they've been assessed, and they don't appear to have been assessed. There's also, I'm probably not going to be able to talk about the amount of risk at this stage until we get to the exempt session, but there's clearly substantial risk in a partnership with no guaranteed return in one direction. What I do know, and was public, is that when the Mayor cancelled the Arena project, he stated very clearly there was an option with greater gross value added for the city, for the public, for the community and for the council. We have no information at all, going by the Cabinet papers, for that figure to be available, because we don't appear to have any statement of what the gross value added of the development would be. So that is a considerable risk, to my mind, a considerable gamble, to my mind, and somewhat kind of, I would go as far as to say, a potential folly, because we don't know what we're going to get back from this from this deal. And we don't know if anyone else has been in any conversations with the council who could have offered a better deal. And if they think they could, I think there is a very significant legal risk, because they could challenge, it's called an aggrieved challenge, they could challenge the council and say, why weren't we offered discussions? We can offer more to the city, we'll get our benefit, you'll get yours. And it appears that has not happened. So to my mind, there is no evidence of this proportionality in terms of the return for what we're putting in and what we've already sunk into the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I want to pursue that last point that was made by Councillor Fodor in terms of the aims and objectives of this project. And I'm going to be talking about some things which I'm going to have to stop talking about, so I reserve the right to go to speak about the same things in exempt session as well. Firstly, let me remind you of the remarks that were made following a motion in this council which received unanimous approval in this council, and that was that the success of any development of this site would depend on the creation of jobs, affordable housing, an inclusive economy, a financial control by the local authority, and sustainability. Now, those remarks were made by the mayor in saying why he was not going to, he was going to overturn the will of this council. And I think this, the decision that was made in Cabinet on the 2nd of July should be judged in that context, because that is the aim, that is the objective to which that Cabinet was making a decision. The same person went on to remark that there should be no spend of council money on a venue or a conference centre. And also said that this piece of land with, sorry, I can't read my writing, were best for all, this development should come out to be work the best for all of the people of Bristol. Now, what's being put in front of us here, and irrespective of the detail of how the various risk options and the legal advice pans out, this proposal in front of us here with a massive commitment, and I'm not mentioning figures, but it is a massive commitment, judged against the £150 million that the arena would have cost, not would have lost, but would have cost, it's a staggering reversal of that initial aims and objectives. In other words, the Cabinet was not asked or did not undertake its duty to deliver those objectives which were stated in this council chamber by the person who presides over this city council. So in the first instance alone, the Cabinet were not doing what they were required to do. They then have taken, to my mind, and I think it's borne out by the legal papers that we've had, which I'm not going to refer to at the moment, it is very clear that of the number of options that were originally delivered to them at the very early stages of seeing how there could be a relationship between a private developer, and it turns out to be one single private developer rather than any competitive element, the relationship between one private developer and this council in terms of risk, it seems that we've taken something rather high up the scale of that risk, and we have taken something which gives us very, very little control. Now, I'm not going to enlarge on those because I'm going to walk into dangerous territory, but I do wish to enlarge on that in exempt session. Thank you.
Anybody else from those calling in? Councillor Smith?
Yeah, just to say, Chair, at risk of repeating what's already been said, the crux of this argument, I think, lies in what we're not allowed to talk about in open session. Personally, my view is that the public are entitled to know what's happened here, but I accept the legal advice that we can't talk about it openly, so reluctantly, I will reserve any further remarks until we're in exempt session.
that's everything.
So just speak very briefly, Don. If that's
okay, Jerome. Yeah.
I mean, I think the key thing from my perspective is the issue of proportionality. If the council's objective is to have affordable housing and a conference centre on this site, the risk of that not happening by going down this route is very high. The risk of legal challenge is very high, and the risk of not getting the best deal is very high.
Thank you. We now turn to members of the committee. Oh, is that it? Okay. We now turn to members of the committee who are entitled to ask questions of those who are calling in. So if you have questions for those who are calling in, then please raise your hand. Councillor Hopkins.
Have any of you seen any of the documents, conversations, emails leading up to the paperwork that we've actually had eventually presented to us today? Because clearly there's a lot happened before these papers happened in terms of discussions between the Mayor, L&G, etc. Because we heard fairly early that L&G was actually involved in this process. So do you have any other knowledge of that?
Councillor Comley.
No, the call-in was based entirely on the publicly available documents that were sent to Cabinet and documents that had been seen publicly previous to that. It wasn't based on any special knowledge.
Can I perhaps say something on that too? There is, and it's been partly closed today, but there is a huge gap between what is in the Cabinet papers and what we were given as a single piece of the legal advice, and it's clear that there was a lot of stuff between those two positions. Only some of which we've seen very, very lately today.
Councillor Clark.
Can I just ask a process?
Sorry, Jerome. Did you wish to
comment?
comment?
I was going to answer Gary's question.
Go ahead.
Please answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two parts of the freedom of information requests that I would pick out. I think one is the correspondence with L&G. The question had been asked whether it was the council that had initiated the partnership and the working arrangements with L&G, or whether it was L&G itself, and that question has never been answered. And the correspondence that's been published between L&G and the council is sufficiently redacted not to make that clear, and the reasons for that redaction are linked to environmental legislation. That seems a very unlikely reason to be able to defend not releasing the full correspondence with L&G. And so I think that if there is appeal on what's actually been shown by the council through the freedom of information request, that further potentially damaging information for the council about how the relationship has been structured could be revealed. Additionally, what was presented at the time of the rejection of the arena on Arena Island was reference to individuals who were making voluntary comments about the suitability of the alternative developments. One of the things that's come out of the Freedom of Information requests is that actually the Mayor was writing to the Chair of Homes England, who is, I think, your former boss, Colin, isn't he? Yes. Right. So the Mayor wrote to the Chair of Homes England suggesting what the exact wording should be for him to approve of the proposed development. So I think when we're looking at the structure of the deal in totality, we need to be aware about how it will look in terms of whether it feels like a sweetheart deal or not.
Session.
Councillor Clark had his hand up. In that case, Councillor Gollop had his hand up. Yeah. In that case.
Basically, at OSM the other day, it was admitted that the statement from Councillor Cheney that legal advice, this legal advice had been seen, was not correct, and an assurance was given that at this meeting that would be publicly put on record, because I think that's quite important, particularly from someone who doesn't seem to have read the legal advice himself.
You're referring to? When was that said?
It was said in Sorry. It was. He actually said in Cabinet that the legal paperwork had been seen through scrutiny, and it had not. And at OSM, we asked that be put on record that was an error, but in the light of this call-in, quite a significant error. So we need that actually now on the record, please.
Certainly, yeah. Have you been reading your legal paperwork?
So actually, I have re-listened to the recording of that. What I did say was that it would be, and then when somebody responded with, so it has been seen, I said absolutely. So that is a genuine mistake on my part. My original response was that it would be seen. You can see that again on the webcast if you want to go back and look, and it will be before the decision is made.
Councillor Clark.
It's kind of a process question, Chair. So at this stage, can we ask officers questions?
No. You're asking the panel, the call-in people.
So we can't ask officers questions at any time during
Yes, you can, later in the process.
Thank you.
Has anyone got any questions for the callers in? Councillor Gollop.
First was a comment that I was delighted to hear Councillor Cumley recognising the benefits of market testing, and I welcome that. But what I was interested in looking at this, and I'd really just like your response on that, is I was trying to look at how does one measure proportionality? Because we've got a description of a project, but actually we haven't got any figures to measure proportionality against. And the second question, because I think some of your political opponents might suggest that this is purely a politically motivated comment, and could you perhaps respond by putting the proportionality in context a little bit more, just to relieve that particular point?
So, how do we measure proportionality without figures? Well, I mean, if we had something to compare it to, and that was why I'm embracing market testing, if we had something to compare it to, some other offer from another developer, some idea of whether we were in the right ballpark, then we would be able to make some judgment about proportionality. I think we, from the information that has gone to Cabinet, we have no idea if this deal is proportionate to the aims that we're trying to achieve, because we have nothing to compare it to. So, so that's how I would look at proportionality without having all the figures in front of me. As to whether this is politically motivated, I think if I was looking to score political points, there are much more sexy subjects that I could be throwing at the press. I don't think I would be asking people to comb through lengthy documents to try to get to the bottom of whether the council is securing value for money and adhering to Article 14 of the Constitution. I think it would be a strange course to follow. The reason for this call-in is that looking at that deal, I couldn't believe that this was the best use of that public land. And looking at the way that this decision has been reached, I couldn't believe that proper process was being followed. So I hope through this call-in process that we will get a better outcome for the council and the city. Whether I get a win, yay, or not, I don't really care. It's about encouraging, through strong scrutiny, encouraging the Cabinet to make good decisions. That's the only thing it's about, really.
Could I add a remark to that answer, please, Sir Jeff?
Smith comes in, yes.
Okay, thank you. Jeff, it's sort of like taking a decision to jump off the high board without knowing the proportion of water or concrete that's going to greet you on your arrival. That's why I feel this should be called in, and I think that underscores what Eleanor just said.
And if I might, Chair, just say that highlights the difference in attitude to risk, because I'd assess the risk and not consider jumping. But
Councillor Smith.
Thank you. I think in terms of measuring proportionality, what's important isn't just the costs, and as like you say, there's nothing to compare this to, we just don't know. It's also about risk. And I'm not going to go into the detail of it, but we know there is significant risk attached to this decision. And that appears to me to be out of proportion to what it delivers, which is hopefully one office building. That's not actually guaranteed. There's no guarantee this delivers anything. So there's no housing, affordable or otherwise. There's no hotel, there's no conference centre. There's no guarantee this delivers anything at all. And to accept the level of risk that this involves for a very small, hopeful delivery is disproportionate in my view.
The risk, of course, is laid out in the risk register attached to the Cabinet report. So
well,
it has been looked at. You may disagree with it.
We may wish to dispute that when we get to exempt session.
Okay. Any further questions for Martin?
Thanks, Chair. Just a further response to what Councillor Gollop has said in terms of proportionality. I think the thing that struck me, and I'm on the scrutiny panel for growth and regeneration, so I would have expected to see something about this there, or to know that it had been discussed elsewhere, is the absence of what many people call optioneering. What are our options? What are the things that could be attracted to this site? All we know is that just shortly before the Mayor cancelled the public arena on Arena Island, an illustration appeared from one company that purported to show a number of things on a site, and we were told it was going to have all of this housing and offices, a conference centre, and that there was going to be greater gross value added and lower risk for the council and better value for the city. And there are no options. There appears to be no other company, no other set of proposals, and indeed we're not being guaranteed a single thing in that illustration from that one company, because it doesn't actually have to deliver them because we haven't got a contract with them. So to me, the absence of options and the absence of actual returns makes it quite a stark example of something where we have to challenge the route by which this decision was made.
Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair. As you say, there is no evidence of other companies having been involved or had discussions with at all for comparative. Is your view of a deal done with L&G with regard to affordable housing in any way linked to their wriggling out of commitment on affordable housing recently? Has that had an effect upon your judgment of this?
I don't think that was a key factor, but I think when we are trying to evaluate risk and trying to evaluate the likelihood of actually delivering the desired outcomes, the fact that L&G on a similar Temple Quarter site took us to court to avoid giving us the 23 units, was it, of affordable housing that the Development and Control Committee had asked to be delivered on that site as part of the planning process, and whittling it down to 4 units, doesn't suggest that L&G are partners who are enthusiastically offering affordable housing. So it doesn't feed into an impression that we can trust them to deliver this 40% that is hoped for in the Cabinet papers.
Councillor Comley, would you like to clarify whether that was court or planning inspectorate?
Really sorry, was it planning inspectorate? I do apologise.
Thank you. Councillor Clark? Right. In that case, I believe we move to questions for the officers. Is that correct?
Presentation by the officers.
Oh, presentation. Sorry. Presentation by the officers.
Well, actually, can I just open with what I think is a fundamental point to the entire conversation we've had so far, which is that it strikes me that everyone is potentially, or from what I've heard from everyone so far, is a misunderstanding about what this decision was. This decision was to agree 3 fairly tame things, well, 2 at least. So one was to agree a non-binding strategic partnership with LNG, which is a citywide above and beyond Temple Island. The second was to agree an in-principle decision to work up essentially to start the work on a contract negotiation between ourselves and LNG with no decisions have been made, there's no contract signed, no one has agreed to anything yet beyond the fact that both sides are going to spend some money on working up an agreement from here. And thirdly, to earmark £500,000, that is the big decision in there, to earmark £500,000 to continue to work that, to support the legal costs and all the other things that will come out of a major contract negotiation like that. So it strikes me that everyone has made some fairly valid comments, all of which can be addressed in scrutiny at the point at which we get towards making an actual decision on this site. At the moment, we haven't done that. This is an in-principle decision to have a continual conversation we've already been having with LNG and to spend some money on working up a contract, which will then go through all of the usual council process. So it strikes me that there have been a lot of valid points raised and a lot of interesting questions asked. None of them are relevant to the decision that went to Cabinet in July. Similarly, the legal advice, which we've heard a bit about, the legal advice we've received actually relates to the point at which we make a decision on the contract. What we've done so far is make a decision to continue to run the project through the next gate and allow LNG and ourselves to spend some money on working that up. And that is absolutely key to this whole conversation, because the conversation so far has been about something that hasn't been decided yet.
And so yes, officers, Colin, would you like to say something? Or
the only point I would add to what Craig's just said is that the scheme that is before you here in relation to the LNG scheme is entirely commensurate with the alternative scheme proposals which were considered by Cabinet in September and were the subject to the KPMG report.
And therefore have the same GVA properties and so on that we anticipated at that point. But again, this is only in principle decision to continue to work up an agreement between us, not the actual decision which will go through the full scrutiny process at the time.
And would any other officers like to make any comments before I hand over to Councillor Hopkins, who wants to ask some questions?
Yes. The decision actually says it's going to be LNG. That's a very, very significant decision. It doesn't say we're looking at other potential suppliers. It doesn't look at other options that are being considered. It takes us down a route, and it also hands power to delegated power down to allow decisions to take place which might otherwise be more publicly examined.
No, I don't agree. I mean, it does, I suppose it takes us down a route in that we're spending money towards a decision, but that doesn't mean that decision will be made at the end of it. It will go through scrutiny, it will go through Cabinet in the usual way, and at the end of it, no decision may be reached. We may not get through contract negotiations and agreeable terms for both sides, and the contract never gets any further than this. So I fundamentally don't agree with that.
Councillor Clark.
Yeah, thank you, Craig, for that clarification. I'm not sure it binds us into LNG or not, but it does delegate authority to negotiate and agree a memorandum of understanding. Now, I understand that memorandum of understanding isn't legally binding, but nevertheless, it is an agreement to proceed in good faith in a certain way with a project. So I think it's slightly disingenuous to say that no decisions were made at the Cabinet, which should be subject to this call-in?
The MOU is on a wider, just a generic agreement between ourselves and LNG to work together for the good of the city. Now that's not in any way binding. Is it even a key decision? Would be a question. I mean, it probably should be. It certainly should be aired publicly. Is it a key decision to have a memorandum of understanding that we're going to work together in the future?
I mean, that begs the question, why was the legal advice obtained on such a specific point? Because clearly, I mean, I'm not going to tread on dangerous ground, but let me just put it like that. So why was the legal advice obtained on that very specific point if this was a wide-ranging memorandum of understanding intended to cover some kind of strategic partnership?
So the legal advice has been obtained for what will happen as we get further down the line. As you'd imagine, if this project runs through, we're going to need to understand the type of contracts we can agree. We can't do that if we don't understand the context in which we're able to make those agreements. But none of that has been agreed yet. This is all very, I mean, it's a project update essentially, plus an agreement to earmark some money.
Gollop?
If I can follow on from that, great, because there's a number of things here that I really don't quite follow. Because if this is as general a decision as you say, I don't understand why we have such incredibly detailed legal advice. I'm no expert on what legal advice costs, but what I've seen doesn't come cheap. A heck of a lot of council taxpayers' money has been spent on that. And I could speculate how many into six figures it goes, but it's a big sum. So I don't understand why such specific, such detailed advice has been obtained if we're not really certain we're going ahead. The other question I have for you is actually in the practical way of the way this place works. Most members will have seen situations where something that's come forward and we're told, oh, well, you don't need to get involved in that because this is just indicative. And the next time you get presented with it, it's actually a decision that's been taken on the back of the indicative proposals that were put forward. So actually, we are being persuaded that something is not important at this stage, not worthy of our attention. But actually, by the time we come to look at it, it would be too late. And the whole issue of proportionality and market testing and something to compare with, if what you're saying is right, we're going to spend £500,000 and we're going to work up the agreement with Legal in General, even though we don't know whether it's the best available for the market. The final point for now, which I know you can't answer in detail in public session, but which I want to put on record, is that from the legal advice that has been given, I cannot see how the decision to proceed could possibly have been arrived at, and I need an explanation, a very detailed explanation of how that could have happened.
So I think we're talking about two things, aren't we? So the legal advice for this decision is very different to the legal advice for the context for making the subsequent decisions on the contract. So that extensive legal advice, which I know you've all seen this afternoon, relates to if this goes any further and we do get into a contract, that's the context in which we know we can make decisions or can't make decisions. That's very different to this decision, the legal advice is attached to the cabinet paper and is not as you just outlined. So that was the context. Sorry, what was your second point? Oh, so yeah, around being led down a path that you and that decisions are made. I mean, I take your point that has traditionally been the way things happen here. We have committed, and I'm committing that Scrutiny will absolutely have a part to play through this decision process. So I take your point. I'm hoping that it won't apply in this case. I certainly have no intention of it doing so.
Any further questions for the officers from the committee? Stephen.
I've got two questions really. I'm interested in the enabling works. This is probably for Colin. I'm not sure. I'm interested in the enabling works. There's talk of further remediation needed. I know Swerd has spent I think 28 million on the remediation. So I'm slightly surprised to read that there's more needed. There's talk of widening road, changing roads, possibly building bridges. Would this be the £25.6 million that hasn't been spent on the arena? Is that the money that's now going to be spent on these enabling works?
Well, at this point, we don't know how much money you're going to spend on enabling works. We need to do that detailed analysis of the development proposals, and that's in part what the £500,000 will be spent on. So whether or not we contract with Legal and General further down the line, that is work that would be valuable to us that we would need to undertake in any case. There's work to do with Network Rail in relation to the proximity of the railway. There's work to do in relation to the proximity of the university campus. There's work to do in terms of further geotechnical work, the river wall, etc., etc. All of that work in a scheme of this complexity needs to be undertaken.
I suppose the point I'm trying to allude to is that if this it does sound like a very expensive piece of work, and if this 25.6 million or some other sum is spent on it, clearly that's monies that L&G are going to get the major benefit from. But I accept you don't know how much things are going to cost, so I accept your answer. Craig, a question for you, and I'm not being rude, genuinely, but have you actually read the legal advice?
Absolutely, at length, and been through numerous meetings to discuss it.
Thank you.
Councillor Gollop.
Thank you, Chair. I just wondered if officers could clarify for me, indicatively, how many Freedom of Information requests have been made in respect of Arena Island and Temple Island, how many have been answered and how many have been refused, and whether any of those that have been answered would have been helpful to members of this panel in considering the issues before us.
I'll get you that information. It's over 70, though. Over 70.
And have any of them been answered, or have they all been refused?
I will get back to you on that information. We'll go back and check and go back to you.
Can I just ask, are we able to have that information? Because I think that is relevant to what we're considering now, and therefore, are we able to get that information while we're in session?
Can you explain the connection, Jeff? Because I've missed it. I don't understand the connection between the number of FOIs and what we're doing now.
Well, I don't know what the connection is because I don't know what the FOIs are and what's been refused. But it seems to me that in terms of public information, it would actually be very useful to know what questions had been asked and what answers had been given or what answers had been refused, because I think that is relevant to the whole process we are considering.
Can I just to be clear, what the calling committee are looking at is the decision that was taken by Cabinet and how the rules of Article 14 were observed. So that's what the calling committee need to put their minds to.
But if I might say, if there are answers to freedom of information questions that are relevant to that, this panel needs to know. And if we don't know what's been asked and what's been responded to,
you can ask questions now. You can ask the questions now, can't you, Jeff? You can ask those questions now. That's what we're here for.
That's what I'm asking. What freedom of information questions have been asked and what answers have been given and what have been refused?
I think it would be useful if you could clarify, Councillor Gollop, on what basis you think that would assist the calling committee to assess the decision that was made by the Cabinet, so that we can establish the link.
Well, I can only tell you that the freedom of information requests that I've been notified of, that if answers had been given, they would have helped me in assessing this position, but answers were refused and therefore are not of any assistance to me whatsoever. So I only know of those I've been notified of. I do not know of the other 67. and consequently, I'm sorry, Nancy, but I can't answer your question
I
because I don't know what the information is.
What's happening with this thing? Anything else, or shall we move into a closed session? Do you have further questions for the officers? Okay. Thank you. I have my script. Under Section 100A(4) of the Local Government Act 1972, the public be excluded from the meeting for the following item of business on the grounds that it involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in paragraph 5 of Part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Act. Could I ask the public to leave at this point? We will invite you back in when we have finished discussing the exempt items to hear our conclusion.